A lone figure moved against the dreary backdrop of the woods. A young woman, her silhouette a stark contrast to the muted greens and grays of the forest. She moved with an unsettling grace, her steps sure-footed on the damp earth. Rain pattered softly on the leaves above, a constant rhythm in the stillness of the woods. This was Amelia, and she found solace in the solitude of nature, even in its most melancholic forms. The rhythmic thud of her boots was the only sound that dared to break the silence. She carried her pack with ease, a testament to her many solitary journeys into the wilderness. Each step deeper into the woods seemed to pull her further away from the world she knew, deeper into a realm untouched by the clamor of civilization. The air grew heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was an aroma that spoke of secrets, of a world hidden beneath the canopy, unseen and unheard. Amelia moved with a familiarity that bordered on instinct, her senses heightened by the solitude. She was a creature of habit, drawn to the familiar embrace of the wilderness time and time again. The forest welcomed her back without judgment, its silence a comforting blanket against the noise of her everyday life. The rain intensified, the droplets growing larger, pounding a steady rhythm against the forest floor. Still, Amelia pressed on, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. She was searching for something, though what that was, even she couldn't say for sure. Perhaps it was a sense of peace, a moment of quiet reflection amidst the chaos of the world. Or maybe it was something more profound, a connection to something larger than herself, a primordial energy that pulsed within the heart of the forest. Whatever it was, Amelia was drawn to it, compelled to answer its silent call. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the light began to fade, the shadows growing longer and more pronounced. The rain, no longer a gentle patter, now fell in sheets, a relentless torrent that threatened to consume the world. Most would seek shelter, but not Amelia. She embraced the deluge, tilting her head skyward, letting the icy water wash over her face. In the symphony of the storm, she found a strange sense of peace, a primal connection to the raw power of nature. The heavy rainfall transformed the forest floor into a network of muddy streams, each one carrying fallen leaves and twigs like tiny boats. The air, thick with the scent of petrichor and damp earth, clung to Amelia as she walked, a tangible reminder of the wild beauty that surrounded her. The forest had taken on an ethereal quality, the trees swaying rhythmically in the wind like ancient dancers, their branches reaching out to her like skeletal fingers. Despite the downpour, Amelia continued to move with an uncanny grace, her feet navigating the treacherous terrain with ease. She had long since learned to read the language of the forest, to anticipate its every twist and turn. The rain intensified, blurring the line between the sky and the trees, transforming the world into an abstract painting of greens, grays, and browns. There was a certain beauty in the violence of the storm, a raw power that resonated deep within Amelia's soul. She felt strangely alive, invigorated by the relentless assault of the elements. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful cry that seemed to echo her own unspoken emotions. It was as if the forest itself was sharing in her solitary journey, accompanying her with its own symphony of sound and fury. Then, as abruptly as it began, the rain stopped. An unnatural silence descended upon the forest, broken only by the dripping of water from the leaves above. The air, still heavy with moisture, hung stagnant, thick with anticipation. Amelia paused, her senses on high alert. The sudden hush was unsettling, a stark contrast to the symphony of the storm. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The oppressive silence pressed in on her, amplifying the subtle sounds of the forest. The dripping water now sounded like footsteps, the rustling of leaves like whispers carried on the wind. The air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable and vaguely metallic, sent a shiver down her spine. Amelia scanned her surroundings, her eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. The forest, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and menacing. The trees, once majestic sentinels, now loomed over her like grotesque guardians of some ancient and malevolent power. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her composure. She pushed it down, reminding herself that she was alone, that the forest held no real danger. But deep down, a primal instinct whispered a warning, urging her to turn back, to seek the safety of the familiar. She ignored it, her curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in atmosphere. She had never experienced anything quite like this before, and a part of her, a dark and curious part, wanted to understand. A low growl, barely audible above the dripping water, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Amelia's system. It seemed to originate from deep within the woods, a guttural sound that spoke of something ancient and hungry. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife she always carried at her hip. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the forest. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct snapping of a twig. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting back and forth trying to pierce the gloom. The shadows seemed to writhe and dance around her, taking on sinister shapes in her heightened state of awareness. Fear, no longer a whisper, now roared in her ears, urging her to flee. She took a hesitant step back, her eyes never leaving the spot from which she thought the sounds had come. The air crackled with tension, thick with the musk of something wild and dangerous. A low, guttural growl, closer than before, sent a shiver down her spine. Something was out there, watching her, its presence a palpable weight in the stillness of the forest. The forest, once a source of comfort and solitude, now felt like a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Amelia knew she had to get out of there, to find shelter before whatever was stalking her decided to make its move. But her feet seemed rooted to the spot, her body frozen by a primal fear that threatened to consume her. Amelia pressed on, her pace quickening as the last vestiges of daylight faded. The forest, now cloaked in an eerie twilight, seemed to close in around her, the trees looming like silent giants. She could feel the weight of their gaze upon her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, eager to claim her for their own. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Despite her growing unease, Amelia pressed on, driven by a primal need to find shelter before nightfall. She knew that darkness brought with it a new set of dangers, both real and imagined. The forest, already menacing in the fading light, would transform into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, its secrets hidden from the prying eyes of the day. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, she stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center, nestled amongst the trees, stood a dilapidated wooden cabin. Its roof was partially caved in, and its windows were boarded up, but it offered at least a semblance of shelter from the elements. Relief washed over Amelia, a brief respite from the growing fear that gnawed at her insides. She approached cautiously, her hand hovering over the hunting knife at her hip. The cabin, though dilapidated, exuded an eerie silence, as if it had been abandoned for decades, untouched by human hands. Taking a deep breath, Amelia knocked tentatively on the weathered wood. The sound echoed through the clearing, swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air. No answer. Amelia tried the doorknob, surprised to find it unlocked. She pushed the door open with a groan of rusty hinges, stepping inside cautiously. The interior of the cabin was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and the floor was littered with debris. It was clear that no one had set foot in here for quite some time. Amelia shivered, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The silence in the cabin was even more oppressive than the silence of the forest outside. It was as if the very walls were closing in on her, suffocating her with their stillness. She longed for the sound of her own voice, for any sound at all to break the unnerving quiet. Moving cautiously, she explored the small space. There was a fireplace, its hearth cold and empty, and a rickety table with 2 chairs, one of which lay broken on the floor. A tattered blanket was draped across the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. Amelia found a box of matches and some kindling near the fireplace, her spirits lifting slightly at the prospect of a fire. As darkness fell completely, Amelia huddled close to the warmth of the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Exhaustion, both physical and mental, finally overtook her, pulling her down into a restless sleep. Her dreams were a chaotic jumble of images and sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the guttural growl of an unknown creature. She tossed and turned, her subconscious mind replaying the events of the day, amplifying her fears. A sharp ray of sunlight slicing through the cracks in the boarded-up windows jolted Amelia awake. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest, her body stiff and sore from sleeping on the hard wooden floor. She looked around the cabin, her mind still foggy with sleep, trying to recall where she was. The events of the previous day came flooding back, the relentless rain, the oppressive silence of the forest, the strange cabin in the clearing. She remembered the fear that had gripped her, the feeling of being watched, hunted, but as she looked around the cabin, now bathed in the warm glow of the morning sun, it all seemed like a bad dream. Amelia got to her feet, stretching her stiff muscles. She walked over to the window, prying a loose board away from the frame. The clearing outside was bathed in the golden light of early morning, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Birdsong filled the air, a stark contrast to the eerie silence she had experienced the night before. Taking a deep breath of the fresh morning air, Amelia stepped out of the cabin. She needed to clear her head, to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As she made her way through the clearing, she noticed something strange. The path she had taken the day before, the one that had led her to the cabin, was gone. In its place was a wall of thick, impenetrable undergrowth. Amelia's brow furrowed in confusion. She could have sworn this was the way she had come. Had she taken a wrong turn somewhere? She scanned her surroundings, trying to get her bearings, but the forest all looked the same, a sea of green and brown with no discernible landmarks. A sense of unease crept back into her mind, twisting in her gut like a living thing. She had a strange feeling that something wasn't right, that something was off. The forest seemed different somehow, the air thicker, the silence heavier, as if the very trees were watching her, their branches like grasping claws against the blue sky. She decided to retrace her steps, hoping to find a familiar landmark, a break in the trees, anything that could help her find her way back to the path. But the forest seemed to twist and turn around her, leading her further and further astray. The sun, which had been high in the sky just moments ago, was now starting to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Panic began to rise in Amelia's chest, a cold knot of fear tightening its grip around her heart. She was lost, hopelessly and utterly lost. And as darkness descended once more, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone, that something was watching her from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Amelia stumbled through the undergrowth, her clothes torn, her body weary. The forest had taken on a sinister quality, the trees twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out to her like grasping claws. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, like blood and honey. Then she heard it again, the sound that had haunted her dreams the night before. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very air around her. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees surrounding her. Amelia froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the forest. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement, any indication of what might be making that sound. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on leaves and twigs. Something was moving through the undergrowth, something large and powerful, and it was getting closer. Terror, raw and primal, surged through Amelia, urging her to run, to hide, to do anything to escape the unseen predator that stalked her through the darkening woods. The growl seemed to hang in the air, a tangible presence that pressed against Amelia's eardrums. She couldn't pinpoint its source, the sound seeming to come from every direction at once. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The woods around her, once a source of comfort and solace, now felt like a suffocating prison, closing in on her with every passing moment. The forest floor seemed to shift beneath her feet, the shadows cast by the trees lengthening and deepening as the light continued to fade. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at the edges of her composure, urging her to run, to flee blindly into the deepening gloom. But something held her rooted to the spot, a strange mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Amelia strained her ears, listening for any sound that might betray the creature's location. But the forest had fallen eerily silent, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears, a steady rhythm against the oppressive silence of the woods. A fine tremor ran through her body, a primal response to the unseen danger lurking in the shadows. Slowly, cautiously, Amelia drew the hunting knife from its sheath, the cool metal a comfort against her clammy palm. The familiar weight of the blade in her hand did little to ease the fear that coiled tight in her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that sent chills down her spine, that she was outmatched, that whatever hunted her in the deepening twilight was far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered before. Section 2. Unnatural Fauna. As darkness tightened its grip on the forest, Amelia noticed a change in the woods around her. The trees, once familiar in their majesty, now seemed to twist and contort before her very eyes, their bark taking on the appearance of writhing flesh. The leaves, once a vibrant green, now hung limp and lifeless, their edges tinged with an unnatural shade of purple. The undergrowth, too, had taken on a disturbing aspect. Vines, thick as a man's arm, snaked across the forest floor, their surfaces covered in pulsating bioluminescent veins. Strange fungi, glowing with an eerie internal light, sprouted from decaying logs and fallen branches, casting an unsettling glow upon the forest floor. Even the air itself seemed to thrum with an alien energy. The sweet, metallic scent intensified, now laced with a cloying undertone that reminded Amelia of rotting meat. It clung to the back of her throat, thick and suffocating, making her gag. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled, her hand instinctively reaching out to steady herself against the rough bark of a nearby tree. It was as if the very fabric of the forest was unraveling, the natural order of things coming undone at the seams. The line between predator and prey, between plant and animal, seemed to blur and distort, creating a nightmarish landscape that defied all logic and reason. Fear, no longer a primal instinct but a cold, hard reality, pulsed through Amelia's veins, urging her to flee this corrupted Eden. Section 3. The metallic scent. The metallic scent intensified, swirling around Amelia like a living thing. It was suffocating, making her eyes water and her stomach churn. She choked back a sob, her fear threatening to overwhelm her. The air crackled with a strange energy, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a towering oak, its branches twisting and contorting above her like the limbs of some grotesque, ancient being. The tree offered little comfort, its once familiar presence now warped and alien in the deepening darkness. She could feel the vibrations of the forest floor beneath her feet, the tremors growing stronger with each passing moment. A low, guttural growl, closer than before, ripped through the silence, seemingly echoing from within the very trees themselves. Amelia flinched, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. Her breath hitched in her chest, and she dared not move a muscle, terrified that any sound, any movement, would betray her location to the unseen predator stalking her through the gloom. The forest, once a sanctuary, had become a hunting ground, and she was the prey. The air itself seemed to throb with malice, the very trees watching her with a cold, predatory hunger. Panic welled up inside her, threatening to burst forth in a torrent of fear-driven screams. Section 4. The Sun's Strange Behavior. Looking up for a brief moment, Amelia noticed another unsettling anomaly. The sun, which should have been steadily sinking towards the horizon, seemed frozen in place, suspended just above the treetops. Its light, however, was fading rapidly, as if some unseen entity were slowly extinguishing it, casting the forest in an eerie twilight gloom. The shadows cast by the trees, no longer natural in their form, twisted and writhed on the forest floor like living things. They stretched and contorted, reaching towards her like grasping claws, their edges blurring and shifting as if they possessed a life of their own. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping dramatically as the unnatural twilight deepened. A wave of dizziness washed over Amelia, stronger than before, and she stumbled, her vision swimming. The metallic scent intensified, now so overpowering that it brought tears to her eyes. She gagged, her stomach churning with nausea. It felt as if the very air she breathed was toxic, slowly poisoning her with each inhale. Fear, primal and all-consuming, threatened to shatter her already fragile composure. She had to get out of this forest, out of this nightmare. But her legs felt like lead, her body heavy and sluggish, as if the very forest itself conspired to keep her trapped within its grasp. Through the haze of fear and disorientation, a glimmer of hope appeared. In the distance, just beyond a thicket of twisted, gnarled trees, Amelia spotted a faint light. It flickered weakly, like a candle flame struggling to survive a gust of wind, casting long, dancing shadows through the trees. For a moment, doubt warred with hope within Amelia's chest. Was it real, this beacon in the deepening darkness, or merely a figment of her fear-addled imagination? Had the forest, in its twisted game, conjured up this false promise of safety, luring her deeper into its grasp? She hesitated, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. The rational part of her mind screamed at her to stay put, to find a place to hide, to wait for dawn. But something in the flickering light, a desperate, almost pleading quality, drew her towards it, promising a haven from the nightmare that had ensnared her. Taking a deep breath, Amelia pushed through the undergrowth, her eyes fixed on the distant light. The metallic scent, though still present, seemed to lessen with each step she took towards the beacon, replaced by the more familiar, earthy scent of damp leaves and decaying wood. As she pushed through a final thicket of thorny vines, the source of the light came into view. It was the cabin, the dilapidated wooden structure she had taken shelter in the previous night. Relief so potent it nearly brought her to her knees, washed over her in a dizzying wave. The cabin, with its crumbling walls and boarded-up windows, had never looked more welcoming. It was a beacon of familiarity in a sea of uncertainty, a tangible reminder of the world beyond the madness that had overtaken the forest. Amelia stumbled towards the cabin, her legs heavy and trembling beneath her. The growl, which had seemed so close just moments before, was gone, replaced by an unnerving silence that pressed in on her from all sides. She could feel eyes on her, watching her every move, but she dared not look back, terrified of what she might see lurking in the shadows. Reaching the cabin door, Amelia threw it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her and fumbling for the latch. She leaned against the rough wood, her chest heaving, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She was safe, for now at least. But as she stood there, catching her breath, a chilling thought took root in her mind. What if the forest wasn't finished with her yet? What if this was just the beginning of a much darker game? Amelia stood, heart pounding in the suffocating stillness of the cabin. It was as she had left it. Fire dwindled to embers, shadows clinging to the corners. Yet a disquieting familiarity hung in the air, a sense of déjà vu that sent shivers down her spine. It was as if she had been here before, lived through this exact moment already. The silence, thick and heavy, pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic beating of her own heart. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of leaves outside the boarded-up windows sent a jolt of fear through her. The air, thick with the lingering scent of damp earth and decay, seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't quite decipher. She moved cautiously towards the fireplace, her hand brushing against the rough-hewn stone of the mantelpiece. A fine layer of dust covered the surface, undisturbed except for a single solitary footprint, her footprint. The sight sent a chill down her spine, confirming her growing sense of unease. How was this possible? She had been the only one here, hadn't she? The memory of the previous day, of the strange occurrences in the woods, flooded back with unsettling clarity. The shifting paths, the unnatural creatures, the oppressive atmosphere, it had all felt so real, so tangible. But now, surrounded by the familiar confines of the cabin, it all seemed impossibly distant, like a bad dream slowly fading with the light of day. Amelia tried to convince herself it was exhaustion, the lingering effects of fear playing tricks on her mind. She had been through a lot, after all. But deep down, a primal instinct whispered a different story. A story of a power far older and more insidious than she could comprehend. The forest, she realized, wasn't just a place. It was an entity unto itself, with its own rules and its own terrifying agenda. She thought back to the stories her grandfather used to tell, tales of ancient spirits dwelling within the heart of the woods, of places where time and reality blurred, where the unwary could become hopelessly lost, trapped forever in a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. At the time, she had dismissed them as folklore, harmless tales meant to frighten children. Now, she wasn't so sure. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on her, a palpable sensation that sent chills down her spine. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a fly caught in a spider's web, struggling in vain against an unseen predator. The forest had drawn her in, lured her into its embrace with the promise of solace and solitude. Now it was closing in, its grip tightening around her like a vice. Amelia knew she had to escape, to break free from the insidious power that held her captive. But how? Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee blindly into the night. But what if that was exactly what the forest wanted? What if, in her desperation, she only served to further its twisted design? A sudden sound, faint but distinct, cut through the silence of the cabin. It was a voice, soft and melodic, yet laced with an undercurrent of urgency that sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. It seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, whispering her name, urging her to listen. "Amelia," the voice whispered again, closer this time, its tone a peculiar mix of warning and reassurance. "You are in danger. You must leave this place." Amelia spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes scanning the darkened corners of the cabin. But there was no one there. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting flickering shadows that danced and writhed on the walls, taking on the appearance of grotesque, shifting forms. Was she losing her mind? Was this some cruel trick of her imagination, a manifestation of her growing fear and isolation? "Don't be afraid, Amelia," the voice whispered, its tone soothing, hypnotic. "I mean you no harm. I am here to help you." The voice, though disembodied, held a strange familiarity, a resonance that tugged at the edges of Amelia's memory. It was like a half-forgotten lullaby from her childhood, a comforting presence in the darkness. But even as she strained to place the voice, a part of her screamed a warning. "Don't trust it. Don't listen." As Amelia stood frozen, caught between curiosity and terror, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the cabin. The air, thick and heavy just moments before, seemed to thin, becoming charged with a strange static energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The shadows in the corners deepened, coalescing into writhing, serpentine forms that danced just beyond the reach of the flickering firelight. The faint light emanating from the embers in the fireplace began to flicker and pulse, casting grotesque, elongated shadows on the walls. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, a sudden chill that cut through Amelia's clothes, as if an icy hand had grasped her heart. Her breath fogged in the air, hanging suspended in the stillness like a specter. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the light began to shift. The warm, orange glow of the embers morphed into a sickly, pulsating green, casting an eerie, otherworldly luminescence throughout the cabin. The shadows on the walls twisted and contorted, taking on the appearance of monstrous faces, their eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence that sent a primal fear coursing through Amelia's veins. The voice, which had been silent for a moment, resumed its whispered pronouncements, its tone no longer soothing, but laced with an undercurrent of urgency that bordered on panic. "You are running out of time, Amelia," it hissed, the words seeming to slither through the air like venomous snakes. "He is coming. You must leave now before it's too late." Amelia stumbled back from the fireplace, her eyes wide with terror, her breath catching in her throat. The room seemed to spin around her, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring into a dizzying kaleidoscope of shadows and whispers. She pressed her back against the rough-hewn log wall, her hand frantically searching for support that wasn't there. As her gaze darted around the cabin, searching for an escape from the growing horror, it landed on a small, tarnished mirror hanging precariously above a rickety washstand in the corner. The mirror, caked in dust and cobwebs, offered only a fragmented reflection of the room, but even in its distorted state, something wasn't right. Staring back at her wasn't her own reflection, but the grotesque visage of a creature that defied description. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a patchwork of rotting flesh and glistening scales, stretched taut over a skull-like face with eyes that burned with an unholy internal light. Its mouth, a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. Amelia screamed, a primal sound of terror that ripped from her throat, echoing through the confines of the cabin like a living thing. She stumbled back, her hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at her hip, but her fingers closed on empty air. She had dropped it somewhere in her panic, lost it in the chaos that had overtaken her. As the creature in the mirror continued to mock her with its grotesque grin, a terrible realization dawned on Amelia. What if this wasn't some external entity, some malevolent spirit haunting the woods? What if the true horror resided not in the shadows around her, but within her own mind? Had the isolation, the fear, finally pushed her over the edge? Was she losing her grip on reality, her sanity unraveling like a threadbare tapestry? The thought terrified her more than anything she had experienced so far. The voice, its tone now laced with a chilling amusement, seemed to echo her darkest fears. "There is no escape, Amelia," it whispered, the sound seeming to come from inside her own head. "You are lost, both within these woods and within yourself." Amelia sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of fear, frustration, and a growing sense of despair. She had stumbled into a nightmare, a labyrinth of her own making, and she couldn't find her way out. The forest had her now, body and soul. A pale, sickly light seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, signaling the arrival of a new day. Amelia, huddled on the floor of the dilapidated cabin, her body racked with tremors, dared to hope. Could this be real, this promise of light after a night of unimaginable terror? Had the monstrous visions, the whispering voices, finally loosened their grip on her sanity? She slowly uncurled from her fetal position, her stiff muscles protesting with every movement. The events of the previous night played back in her mind like a macabre film on a continuous loop. The shifting paths, the grotesque creatures, the terrifying reflection in the tarnished mirror. Had she imagined it all? Was she going mad? Cautiously, she rose to her feet, her gaze drawn to the boarded-up window. Prying a loose board free, she peered out into the forest beyond. The sight that greeted her sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. The forest was bathed in the same unsettling, green-tinged light that had permeated the cabin. The trees, their branches twisted and gnarled, swayed rhythmically in a non-existent breeze, their movements strangely synchronized, like dancers in some macabre ballet. The air hung heavy and still, thick with the metallic scent that had become synonymous with her terror. As Amelia stumbled out of the cabin, her senses reeling, a terrifying familiarity washed over her. The path ahead, barely discernible through the undergrowth, was the same one she had taken the previous day. The same fallen log lay across the path a few feet ahead. The same twisted branch, shaped like a skeletal hand, reached out from the undergrowth, as if beckoning her forward. It was as if time had reset itself, rewinding to that moment when she had first stumbled upon this cursed place. A cold dread settled in the pit of her stomach, a terrifying premonition taking root in her mind. She was caught in a loop, a repeating cycle of terror with no escape. Each day she would relive the same horrors, face the same unspeakable entities, trapped forever in this twisted, nightmarish version of reality. A strangled sob escaped her lips as the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was trapped, alone, at the mercy of a power she couldn't comprehend, let alone fight. The forest seemed to press in around her, the air growing thick and oppressive, the silence punctuated by the distant, unsettling cries of unseen creatures. She could feel eyes on her, watching her every move, their gaze cold and calculating. Desperate for confirmation, for any shred of evidence that contradicted this terrifying new reality, Amelia ran. She ran through the undergrowth, ignoring the scrapes of thorns against her skin, the way the twisted branches seemed to reach out to snag her clothing, to hold her back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs screamed for respite, but still, the forest stretched before her, unchanging, relentless. The path, if it could be called that, led her in circles, twisting and turning back on itself, always returning her to the same clearing, the same dilapidated cabin. Each time she reached the clearing, a flicker of desperate hope would ignite in her chest, only to be extinguished as she realized nothing had changed. The cabin remained the same, a decaying testament to her torment. The forest beyond remained a menacing, ever-present threat, and the loop tightened its grip, each cycle blurring the lines between reality and nightmare a little more. Time itself seemed to warp and distort within the forest's grasp, stretching out the daylight hours into an eternity of fear and anticipation, while the nights became a terrifying freefall into a maelstrom of shadows and whispers. The voice that had haunted her before, the one that claimed to be her ally, was silent now, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to hum with unseen energy, with a growing, malevolent anticipation. As the loop cycled again and again, a chilling realization dawned on Amelia. She wasn't just reliving the same events. She was being watched, studied, her every move scrutinized by an unseen observer. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the sense of being followed by a gaze she couldn't quite place. But as the days, or what passed for days in this timeless prison, wore on, the feeling intensified. She would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the periphery of her vision, shadows flitting between trees too quickly to discern. Once she swore she saw a pair of glowing eyes watching her from the depths of the undergrowth, their gaze filled with a cold, calculating intelligence that sent shivers down her spine. The forest itself seemed to conspire to heighten her paranoia, the trees creaking and groaning even in the absence of wind, their branches brushing against each other, creating the illusion of whispering voices just beyond the reach of her understanding. She was a lab rat in a maze of its own design, her every move observed, analyzed, her terror a source of twisted amusement for the entity that held her captive. The realization that she was playing a part in some elaborate, cruel game orchestrated by an intelligence far beyond her comprehension was almost more terrifying than the physical horrors the forest threw at her. What did it want from her, this entity that toyed with her sanity, that reveled in her terror? Was it simply amusement, a sadistic desire to watch her suffer? Or was there a deeper, more sinister purpose to her torment? Despair threatened to consume her, to sap her will to fight, to escape. What was the point of struggling against the inevitable? The forest had her now, body and soul, and it would never let her go. But even in the face of such overwhelming dread, a spark of defiance flickered within her. She might be trapped, but she refused to be a passive participant in her own destruction. She would find a way to break the loop, to escape the forest's grasp, even if it cost her everything. The game was on, and Amelia, armed with nothing but her wits and her dwindling sanity, was determined to find a way to win. A change swept through the forest, subtle at first, like a discordant note in a haunting melody. The oppressive silence that had become Amelia's constant companion began to shift, punctuated by whispers that slithered through the trees. No longer the comforting rustle of leaves or the creak of ancient branches, these sounds were different, filled with a sentience that chilled her to the bone. At first, the whispers were unintelligible, a cacophony of hissing consonants and guttural murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. But as the loop cycled and Amelia's desperation grew, the whispers gained clarity, resolving into words, then phrases, then sentences, each one a barb aimed at her sanity. Lost, they hissed, their voices a chorus of shadows echoing through the trees. Trapped, forever, hours. The words wormed their way into her mind, planting seeds of doubt and despair. They whispered of her deepest fears, her most closely guarded secrets, twisting them, amplifying them, until she could barely distinguish her own thoughts from the insidious whispers of the forest. Amelia tried to block them out, to focus on the impossible task of escape, but the whispers were relentless. They followed her every move, their tone shifting from mocking laughter to chilling threats, their words a constant reminder of her precarious situation. Driven to the brink, Amelia began to fight back, not against the unseen entity that held her captive, but against the forest itself. She refused to be just another pawn in its twisted game. She would leave her mark, a testament to her struggle, a sign that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit could endure. She started small, carving her initials into the trunk of a towering oak near the cabin, a tangible reminder of her presence in this unreal place. The next day, the carving was gone, the bark smooth and unbroken as if she had imagined it. But Amelia refused to be deterred. She gathered stones, painstakingly arranging them into patterns on the forest floor, circles, spirals, even a crude representation of a human face, its empty eyes staring up at the uncaring sky. Each morning the stones were scattered, her efforts seemingly for naught. Yet she persisted, driven by a primal need to assert her will, to leave some trace of her existence in this timeless prison. She began leaving messages, scrawled on scraps of bark with pieces of charcoal from the fireplace, desperate pleas for help, for understanding, for any sign that she wasn't alone in her torment. The messages, like her other attempts, disappeared with each cycle of the loop, but Amelia clung to the belief that someone, something, was seeing them, that her struggle was not entirely in vain. As Amelia's defiance grew, so too did the intensity of the entity's attentions. The feeling of being watched, once a subtle undercurrent to her terror, now became a palpable presence, a weight that pressed down on her, suffocating her. The glimpses of movement in the shadows became more frequent, more brazen. She would turn, heart pounding, only to find the space empty, the forest holding its breath, masking the presence that she knew lurked just beyond her sight. The whispers, once content to torment her from a distance, now seemed to emanate from the very air she breathed, their voices a chilling cacophony that swirled around her, whispering her name, mocking her efforts, reveling in her growing despair. And then one day, as she knelt on the forest floor, painstakingly arranging stones into a spiral pattern, she felt it, a gaze so intense, so filled with cold alien hunger, that it stopped her in her tracks, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Slowly, she raised her head, her gaze drawn to a towering oak, its branches twisted and gnarled like the limbs of some grotesque ancient being. And there, partially obscured by the shadows, she saw it, a single eye, large and black, with no visible pupil, staring down at her. Terror, primal and all-consuming, threatened to overwhelm Amelia. This was it, the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated, the moment when the entity that held her captive revealed itself, when the game, whatever its twisted purpose, reached its terrifying climax. The whispers, now a deafening roar in her ears, urged her to flee, to seek shelter in the dilapidated cabin, but she knew it was futile. The forest, this entity, whatever it was, held her captive, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. As the figure began to emerge from the shadows, its form resolving into that of a tall, skeletal creature with long, sharp claws and eyes that burned with an unholy light, Amelia understood. The loop, the terror, the whispers. It had all been leading to this moment, a test of her will, her sanity, her very essence. And in that moment of terrifying clarity, she also understood the price of freedom. It wasn't about escaping the forest, for the forest, like the entity it served, was beyond her comprehension, beyond her ability to fight. Freedom, she realized, lay in confronting her fear, in staring into the abyss and refusing to blink. With a trembling hand, she reached out towards the creature, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard surface of its outstretched claw, and in that single, terrifying touch, the loop shattered. The world dissolved around Amelia in a kaleidoscope of light and sound. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on her, the suffocating presence of the entity, vanished in an instant. The whispers, no longer a chorus of torment, but a fading echo, retreated into the depths of the woods, their hold on her sanity finally broken. She lay sprawled on the forest floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror and adrenaline. As her vision cleared, she realized she was no longer in the familiar clearing near the dilapidated cabin. The trees around her were different, their bark a healthy, vibrant green, their leaves rustling gently in a soft breeze. Sunlight, warm and golden, filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It was as if the forest itself had exhaled, releasing her from its grip, expelling her from its twisted reality. The air, no longer thick with the metallic scent of decay, smelled clean, sweet, alive. Birdsong filled the air, a symphony of life that replaced the oppressive silence that had haunted her for what felt like an eternity. Amelia struggled to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her, her mind still reeling from the abrupt shift in reality. She looked around, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings, desperate for any landmark, any sign that could guide her back to the familiar, to safety. The forest, though no longer menacing, seemed vast and disorienting. She wandered for what felt like hours, her internal compass spinning uselessly, her sense of direction shattered along with the loop that had held her captive. The sun, no longer frozen in its unnatural twilight state, continued its descent towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. As dusk approached, panic began to rise in her chest, threatening to overwhelm the fragile sense of relief she had clung to since escaping the entity's grasp. She had escaped one nightmare, only to find herself lost in another. Was she destined to wander these woods forever, a prisoner of her own fear and disorientation? Just when her hope began to dwindle, she stumbled upon a faint trail, barely discernible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rekindle a flicker of hope within her. With renewed determination, she followed the trail, her pace quickening as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. The trail led her through a thicket of dense undergrowth, the branches clawing at her clothes, her skin, as if trying to hold her back. But Amelia pushed on, driven by a primal need to escape the encroaching darkness, to find a haven from the terrors, both real and imagined, that lurked in the shadows. As darkness descended, the familiar scent of wood smoke reached her, carried on the cool evening breeze. It was a welcome scent, a beacon of civilization in the vast wilderness. With renewed energy, she surged forward, emerging from the undergrowth into a small clearing. A campfire crackled merrily in the center of the clearing, casting a warm glow that pushed back the encroaching darkness. A lone figure sat huddled by the flames, their back to her, their features obscured by the flickering light. Amelia hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her instincts screaming at her to flee, to avoid contact with another human being. The memories of her ordeal were still too fresh, the terror too raw, but the lure of warmth, of human companionship proved too strong to resist. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the clearing, her voice a hoarse whisper in the stillness. "Hello?" The figure by the fire stirred, slowly turning to face her. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. The face that met hers was weathered and lined, framed by a shock of gray hair, but the eyes were filled with a kindness, a warmth that instantly put her at ease. The old man, a seasoned woodsman by the look of him, welcomed her with a nod and a gruff, "Well now, ain't seen another soul out this way in a while. You look like you could use a warm fire and a hot meal." And so, Amelia found herself recounting her tale, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as she relived the horror of the past. Days? Weeks? Time had lost all meaning within the confines of the entity's twisted game. The old man listened patiently, his weathered face etched with a mixture of concern and a strange understanding. When she finished, he nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if peering into the heart of the forest itself. "Aye," he said finally, his voice low and rumbling. "This forest, it ain't no place for the faint of heart. Ancient magic slumbers beneath these trees, powerful and unpredictable. Some folks, they hear the call of the wild, but the wild ain't always what it seems." He looked at her then, his gaze piercing, and Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine. "You best be careful, child," he warned. "Some wounds run deeper than flesh and bone. Some scars never truly heal." The next morning, Amelia awoke to the sound of bird song and the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The old man was gone, his campsite empty except for the dying embers of the fire. She searched for him, calling out his name, but the forest remained silent, its secrets safely guarded beneath a canopy of leaves. Had he been real, this woodsman who had offered her shelter and a listening ear? Or had he been another figment of the forest's twisted imagination, a final test before releasing her back into the world? She didn't have an answer, not then, not ever. But as she stood there, at the edge of the clearing, the warmth of the rising sun on her face, she realized something had shifted within her. The terror that had clung to her like a shroud had lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose, a steely resolve that had been forged in the crucible of her ordeal. She had stared into the abyss and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The forest, the entity, had taken its toll, leaving scars both visible and unseen. But it had also awakened something within her, a strength, a resilience she never knew she possessed. As she turned to leave the clearing, her footsteps lighter, her heart filled with a strange mix of trepidation and hope, she cast one last glance over her shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, a tall, skeletal figure with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. The cycle, it seemed, was far from over, but this time, Amelia was ready,